last week, many of the attendees were able to contribute quite a lot of useful thoughts. And for those who weren't here last week, I intend to come back to some of those as we go through. So just very quickly, as a reminder for what we did cover last week, it was very much about the characteristics and drivers and trends that we think are important for 21st century learning. And today, the learning journey experience is not wholly organized and directed through the business, the organization that you work for. Everybody's aware that there's a whole raft of the world of the connected out there. Many people are using that world for learning informally and in many cases formally as well. And how does L&D address that? How do we develop courses that actually make a difference and make learning more interesting? And the whole use of the word courses is one that I will come back to. Anyway, the point is that we said last week we were dealing with what's known as the VUCA world, and that is very much a strange term for some, but it's one that a lot of business organization, business people are talking about in strategic terms. We live in a volatile, uncertain, complicated and ambiguous world. And the point I made last week, and I think is worth repeating, is that what we should be really doing as L&D is turning that into a vision where we understand, we bring clarity and agility. So you can have an L&D derivative of the VUCA acronym. We also think we should be dealing with evidence, not fashion. And by that, I mean the real empirical needs of the business, not being driven because the latest technology has suddenly been announced or it's pertinent, and at the moment the latest iPads or iPhones are out, therefore we've got to have them. How are we going to use them is the next question. We talked a little bit about working with generational learning styles, and again, that created a few comments. People were saying, you know, what were the different styles, which labels were right. We'll come back to that, but the important thing is the labels aren't important. I think it's much more about the way people behave, and the behaviors are typical of certain generations that have either grown into using learning technology, the internet and social media, or it's been there all their lives. So there's the immigrants or the natives, if you like, or the people who use technology. It's about behaviors. And the other topic that we talked a little bit about last week was very much that it's not just about training or learning, it's about performance support. How do we get the impact on people when they just need that information? It's the just-in-time learning, it is performance support tools, and the third aspect was very much about compliance. And again, I will come back to that. So the first thing I did was ask the audience, and for those of you who were here last week, or indeed are new this week, still would like to hear some additional thoughts coming on the chat channel, and that is, what do you think really identifies an organization that's geared for 21st century learning? And some of the comments that we got back last week, I think, were quite revealing, and whilst some of you may be typing up, but it was really the fact that it's very much about an organization that values me as a person, values my career, values my development. That was one topic. And another was very much about how that we can make use of technology in innovative ways, and of course that's in essence what learning technology has always been trying to do, is to innovate the learning process. And there was a talk about having a learning culture as well. But anyway, what we at Line focus on is we believe learning organizations, new learning organizations, are both mature in the way that they use technology. They blend learning together. They make the learning experience personal. They distribute it to where it is needed at the right time and the right place. And in the idea of the new learning organisation, we think it creates a sort of ecosphere which includes all of the people, the process, and the content issues connected to the technology. But everything is underpinned by the organisational and learning culture. So the organisation climate, business climate, the organisation culture for learning, as well as the culture of learners themselves. So we've tried to sort of put that together in that model, but there is many, many pieces that sit behind that, and that's what we want to carry on talking about. Don, anything?
Liking some of the things that are coming through here. Talking about new learning organisations, Steve. An organisation that takes a systems-based approach to capability building. I quite like that. It's a very systematic approach rather than ad hoc way of doing it. And John said it's a clear knowledge-based vision of the future. Knowledge is something, actually, Steve, I've noticed is undergoing a bit of a renaissance at the moment. We had lots of knowledge management stuff in the 90s. It died a bit of a death. It had a bit of a resurgence. It came back again. But I think 2014 is going to be a year when people actually start realising the importance of knowledge, and a knowledge-based vision of the future is very interesting. I liked your point about deal with evidence, not fashion. Martine asked me to explain more about that. Can you explain more about what you mean by deal with evidence and not fashion, Steve? It's your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a topic that we'll come back to later on. But in essence, it means looking at what people are really doing, having evidence of what the real learning needs are, rather than just saying, oh, as I mentioned, the latest iPhone is out, or not to decry Apple and any other technology vendor in so much as they always want to introduce and upgrade the technologies. But it's think about what it is going to be used for first, rather than let's get the technology in and then worry about it afterwards.
There we go.
We've dealt with a number of organisations where they said we bought 20 iPads to do a pilot, but we don't know what
are we going to do with them now? Yeah, it's a classic issue. And then a lot of other useful stuff coming through. I don't want to interrupt the flow, but there's some good stuff here coming through. Agility and the ability for intelligent risk-taking, says John. Tools, says Cedric, to facilitate linking content with people. Great stuff here. And Rich, of course, pointing out, should we be concentrating on pulling content rather than pushing it? Anyway, let's come back to that issue, but I'm going to pass it back to Steve now. Steve.
Okay, and that's a very good point. We often use the words push and pull. I think the new learning organisation works with both. You can't have everything pull, you can't have everything push. Okay, so why is it important? Well, as I said, of the learning journey experience, we talked about that last week. But the important thing is think about the behaviours of the people, think about the Bloom's taxonomy, which is still important, but it needs to be blended so that you actually use the right components to meet the need, whether it is just a simple knowledge transfer or you're actually getting into synthesis and analysis and evaluation. And I think it's really important, and comments last week were saying it's very key that we keep in touch with the technologies and we make use of them. But it's about how that is done and who drives it. Mobile is a really key game changer, we believe, because L&D doesn't uniquely own the ability to bring mobile into the workspace, the organizational space. Nearly all organizations are generating that, managing that activity from places other than L&D. So it's really important that as an L&D professional, we're connected to it, we make use of it, we understand the business priorities and strategy for it. And there's a number of techniques around that which we will talk about quickly in a minute. Just to sort of add a bit more to the commentary, what do you think of the drivers that are creating new ways of learning and development? And again, last week we had a number of comments that came through, and it was quite interesting in so much as the drivers were about individuals demanding information as much as it was about the organisation. But there's also other drivers besides, obviously, technology. What other things do we think are important there?
And we don't want to lead the audience too much. Of course, I've got a whole stack of things in my head that I think are driving the new ways of learning and development, but it's important not to not to suggest those too much. A lot of interesting stuff coming through here, Steve. Pace of change, says Tony. You've got to believe that, haven't you? Things are moving so fast that we can't keep doing things in the old ways.
Yeah, that's right. And pace of change is the heart of where VUCA came from as well, because things are not slowing down. The world of technology is driving not just the learning world, but the whole professional and domestic world. If you like, your personal life is being driven by technology as much as your working life.
Cost reduction, says Norman Lamont 3 times. He's obviously feeling it very keenly at the moment. Con's pointing to cultural, organisational goals and government, and Zahn is talking about different generations in the same society. Business agility, a lot of focus generally on the need to respond to outside changes, whether it's cost cutting, the pace of change generally, or the government pushing things from the outside. So that seems to be a general theme here, Steve.
Okay, well that's absolutely consistent with the sort of things that we got last week, I think. And I think those are the 5 drivers that we've got in one of our blog items there are very much encapsulating all of those sort of comments. But there is also the issue of global skills shortages, and I mentioned that last week. It's making it more difficult for us to recruit the right people into the right jobs. And that may well be where HR and L&D and the whole concept of bringing the recruitment process and the retainment process, or rather than having people move out of the business and losing their skills. But if you are going to have people retiring, for example, how do you use technology to retain their knowledge so that it can be used for the corporate good? A lot of these techniques and the purpose of calling it the New Learning Organisation were underpinned by Senger's 5th Discipline book, which was written way back, I think the late 80s, something like that, early 90s. But it then encapsulated the message that the organisations that will survive are those that are most agile and provide systems that actually support that agility. And it wasn't only about learning, but it was about the whole organisational systems. So again, I don't want to dwell on that, but that's the essence of it. One of the things that we do talk about is what does that mean for us? And we talk about it in the terms of, if you like, human capital themes of performance, development and compliance. And the reason we separate out compliance is because it's really important that we don't treat it typically in the same way that other training is treated. A lot of organisations treat compliance needs as very much a tick box operation, and a comment that was made last week that the regulatory bodies are becoming more aware of that sort of issue and are much more interested in demonstrating how we show performance or behaviour change on the back of meeting those compliance requirements. So we actually think it's quite different in the way that you treat performance, you treat development and you treat compliance. They're owned by different bits of the organisation, for one, where HR may lead the performance bit, L&D lead the development bit, and the legal department own the compliance bit. But of course it all has to come together for the learning journey for the individual. So again, I don't want to dwell on it. There's more information about that online. But one of the case studies I highlighted briefly last week was Virgin Media, where they addressed the approach to compliance training a completely different way, and they used social media, and they turned what was previously a 3-day face-to-face event for their IT folk to develop their ITIL skills, which is customer-facing, customer service type skills, and they turned it into a completely social learning piece, but still provide the structure and the means to capture the responses, but more importantly, demonstrated that the performance improved. And there's a Towards Maturity case study, which is on the screen at the moment, that if you want to know more about that, it's not anything that Line was directly involved in, but we think it's demonstrating capability to do compliance training in a different way. And it's a topic that we also have a number of our clients working with too. Another of our blogs was very much, we talked a bit about this last week. I mentioned earlier the course paradigm. I don't think it's where we should, as learning development people, be focused anymore. Courses are still important for many, but they are not all about just face-to-face. They must be blended. And courses of 10 minutes long, not 10 hours long or 10 days long, I think are what we should be aiming towards. Using short nuggets of information that link together to suit the personal learning journey is the concept there. So many of those other themes, the trends, are all about that. One thing that did come up last week, somebody made a comment that they thought 70-20-10 as a concept was now becoming outdated. And I know there's a lot of you who will be aware of the framework concept of 70-20-10 and the principles of it. I don't know why the comment was made about it becoming outdated, but I'd be interested in thoughts from the audience today as to whether they think that's important still or the world has moved on.
I think that's something we can look at perhaps towards the end. But it's something that's as fundamental as how we learn in organisations. It seems strange that it should be out of date. By the way, if I'm slightly slow here, it's because I'm reading some great chat coming through. Please continue these conversations. Rich and Lee want to pick up the whole point about social networks at the end with Steve. I think it's a really important one as technology that underpins this, and there'll be a whole lot of technology to underpin it. Anyway, sorry, do you want to... Sorry, Steve, I've interrupted you.
No, not at all. That's really helpful, and it gave me a couple of seconds to just read the chats that are coming in too. So, I think you're right. The social, the mobile, and the 70-20-10, the learning architectures that we talk about, I think they're all very important, how they fit together. But at the end of the day, perhaps the eighth one, the personalisation one, is the most important, because people are coming out of the education system. Many, not all, but many of them are now much more akin to learning in a different way, and we should be working with that diversity and working with the approach and the abilities that they have to be self-directed learners. But for example, in the military, I might have mentioned this last week, but it's a very good example in that within the military, when you first become a soldier or an airman or whatever, you have quite a structured approach. But as you progress through your career, you become expected to become more a self-directed learner. And I think that's the point. It's a variable scaffolding for individuals that they can become maturer learners. There's always support and there's always peer help out there when they need it. And that is part of the conversation that we would want to explore a bit more, I think, is how do you do that? What do you need to do for your new recruits, whatever age, whatever capabilities they're coming in with, that they are supported in becoming more self-directed learners? The other topic, main theme, is about technology, and I don't want to dwell on specifics, but Gartner is, for example, one of those organizations that does a lot of research and tracking. They produce these hype curves, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but if you're not, it is a very good idea to be aware of that or have somebody with a technology focus looking at it, because within those technology hype curves, they will highlight in a whole raft of different environments the technologies that are seemingly going to come in the future. And most of these, coming back to the hype, not don't follow the fashion, follow the evidence, that's what this is all about. You know, don't start using a technology just because it's been hyped up and getting a lot of PR about it at the moment. Otherwise, we'll all be training with Google Glass or one of these augmented reality goggles that are coming through, which still has yet to prove itself, but nevertheless, it will over time become stable and useful in some areas. The other area that Gartner produces Magic Quadrants, and interestingly, their view at the moment of the web capability world is that they will put Adobe, for example, ahead of Microsoft and IBM and HP and others in terms of their vision and ability to deliver web enabled content. Not necessarily something that would be of significant interest to us in one respect for general web, but of course it is if you're delivering learning content that way. And Don mentioned, and thank you Don, we had a new blog today which is all about the impact of technology as a driver and as an enabler that's out on our web. Okay, so the other one of many other big topics is cloud computing, for example. And I think it's interesting that the government, with the G-Cloud services offering, is now picking up on that. And I'd be interested in any thoughts from people about whether their organisation are using the cloud, whether they as individuals are using features in the cloud, and what they think of it.
Is it the cloud generally, or is it the government cloud in the UK you're talking about?
I think either. I mean, the G-Cloud is quite coherent in a way, what they've offered to public organisations to use, and that's in all areas of health, education, and local authorities, etc. But there is obviously there are commercial cloud options out there, and a lot of services that we would consider using in learning and development are already cloud-based.
Yeah, we're getting towards what I call learning as a service, something that organisations tap into and buy into, largely located in the cloud, which revolutionises the approach and the disciplines that the internal learning departments have to be excellent at. But that's a whole separate topic we can have down the line.
Yes, indeed. And you just mentioned learning as a service. The acronyms at the very top of that image are infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and specialist cloud services. So it is interesting how it's becoming sort of segmented into categories.
Interesting. Got some feedback from Andrew Jacobs, who works in a local borough in London. You might want to just read that one, Steve. Is G-Cloud the reference point that we might want it to be? He's saying it's still a number of challenges in this implementation, from strategic decisions through tactical deployment to operational use. So Andrew, I definitely trust him as a blogger and somebody who knows what he's talking about. Obviously some thoughts there about how G-Cloud is not perhaps delivering everything that we might want it to be. Anyway.
I think that's a very good comment, Andrew, and I think it would be interesting if you were to plot the current thoughts of the G-Cloud on the hype curve as to where it is, and I agree. I think there is always a challenge with a new concept, a new technology, of how you turn it into an operational and get value and effectiveness out of it.
Okay.
One piece of research that has been published that is really good, albeit from an educational perspective. The reason I think it's good is that one of the authors works for Pearson's, and she was talking a bit about this, and this document is actually much more of a practical toolkit, but what it's saying is you must not forget the sort of learning approach, the pedagogy in the educational terms, to make sure that whatever you're doing about introducing technology, you understand what it is going to do for that learning experience, whether the technology is supporting the teacher or instructor, facilitator, or whether it's supporting the student, or both. And it's really important to address the change aspect, so the system change. So with just 3 key headings and 9 subsets, you can quickly come to a way of RAG rating, if you like, albeit they've got 2 amber levels, amber green and amber red. That's a new concept, I think. But the RAG rating each of those 9, and then seeing what that gives you as an overall technology rating, or an innovation rating. Now, it's not one that we've applied, but I think it's an interesting concept, and be interested in what other people thought. Certainly worth following through. One of our other big topics, which, again, not particularly sexy, but we do really think it is important, that governance of the learning and development capability is very much driven from the business and by the business, as well as having, obviously, key practitioners in the governance group. And I think it's come from a recent study, this concept of having the Executive Council, the Steering Committee and the sort of leads all connected. But I mean, from our perspective, we've always said that governance should have both a strategic and a tactical level. And I'd be interested from the group today is how many of you actually have some sort of governance council?
So this is a pretty straightforward question for the 86 people on the call.
And adding to that, if you do, why, what drove you to having that? And if you don't, why not? And would you think it would be relevant? We didn't get to this point last week, so no. For those of you who were with us last week, this is we're into part 2.
Okay. By the way, Jane is just saying it would be helpful to have some practical examples of how these ideas can work in practice. Well, I actually, to be fair to Steve, he's been sprinkling some practical examples around. But if there's anything specific you'd like an example on, Jane, please do drop through the message. I'm sure Steve will pick up and give some good examples. But governance, looks like we've got a wide range of answers. Some people saying no, some people saying yes, some people talking about further conversations we've been having. Tony says yes, to drive consistency on a global basis, but with some local flexibility, avoiding duplication.
Yeah.
Con seems to have a superfluity of governance.
And one of the key concepts that we believe is important is that L&D within an organisation needs to consider the extended organisation, if you like, the extended enterprise as it's often called, which means your suppliers and your end customers. And does anybody have a governance organisation that includes customer or supplier representatives? Okay, there's Nick Van Dam, who's been around this industry for quite a while. He's Chief Learning Officer at Deloitte now, and he sort of has a view that it's important, coming back to this evidence-based approach, that the avoiding the fads and fashions. We all have our own favourites and things that we think are important in the world of learning and development, but the point is, if you are using evidence and research to base your decisions on, then you don't get sucked into those. I think the other point he is saying very clearly is that if a CLO role is going to be effective, it's about taking a different view, not just doing it better from how we did it yesterday. So taking a different view would also be the point, I think, of making sure that the Learning Council, the Learning Council can actually deliver both the strategic approach as well as the tactical implementation. And I think that's part of what we wanted to really finalise as a key message, that it's important that you connect the learning organisation and integrate it properly within the business. So I've now gone forward to really summarising all of those thoughts, because I think the rest of the time I'd like to sort of exchange some of the thinking coming from the chat channel and try and respond to that. But the key themes that we believe an NLO should curate are those that they've got a learning strategy that's linked to the business strategy, and the learning strategy must include all aspects of learning technology and use of mobile and use of social and things like that. So any learning strategy is always going to be kept up to date and needs to be an agile document and behaviour in itself. The vision of what that learning strategy needs to be is the responsibility of the Governance Council, I think, or the Chief Learning Officer, to communicate and make sure everybody believes and behaves in it that way. And again, that reflects a couple of comments that were made last week, is that if the organisation communicates its objectives and its vision well, then people buy into it. So learning is as much about communication as it is about the process. The business-related governance is obvious. The learner-centric is that personalised approach. And the concept of not being didactic but supported and connected is coming back to my earlier point about the learners having the right level of support to suit their maturity in learning, and encouraging and supporting them to become better self-directed learners using L&D as a reference point, but not the complete driver and indeed the vehicle in which all my learning is done. And that again plays to the whole 70-20-10 concept, and that's why I was interested in people thinking about whether that still resonates for them or not. The accessible word is much more about getting access to the information when I need it, where I need it, but of course accessibility is also another big topic for learning technologies and online content. And the agility of being agile to be able to do things and respond quickly. Again, coming back to Senger's original concept of the fifth discipline, it was all about the most agile organizations are the ones that are going to survive and thrive. Dean, you just said, could you elaborate on the generational learning styles, which you touched on earlier? I think that's a good point. The original X generation, or Generation X, was those that were conceived as having been their whole lives part of the learning online world, having been part of the internet, or rather the internet being part of their lives. Whereas for those of us who were alive and working before 1990, or the early 80s, for those who really were in the techie speak space, we've had to adapt and become digital aware. But the digital natives don't see it as being anything significant. It's part of their everyday lives. And of course, as that's advanced, there are now people entering the current workforce, the sort of so-called millennials or Generation U, who are very much unaware that there was anything before social media. So that's really the point. That, if you like, a timeline defines the groups. But for me, and I think it's really important for all of us to think about, it isn't about how old you are or how young you are. It's about how you behave and how you use these technologies, whether you are encouraged or forced to use the email, virtual classrooms, whatever it is, mobile to learn. Any of these technologies is about behaviour, not about an age. So generational learning styles, I think, are the labels that somebody said are not helpful last week, but I think they define, if you like, the profile of how people work with technology or see it as part of their everyday life.
And I think you raised the point when you mentioned the phrase earlier on that it's less about learning styles and more about the behaviours people exhibit, what they do, than trying to... There's no evidence that being born before or after a particular date has a massive effect on your particular learning style. It's more complicated than that, as you've just said. I'm just going to do a quick recap of the generations of people, because we always have these points coming up on the LSG webinars. You've got baby boomers, those born up to sometime around the early 60s. Generation X comes after that, up to some point in the early 80s. Then you've got Generation Y, or the millennials, people who came of age around the turn of the millennium. And now we have this new generation, Generation U, Generation Z, whoever they are, the people who are younger even than the millennials. It all sums up in Andrew's point: a school leaver joining your organisation today is younger than Google, which is frankly scary. Sorry, Rich says we're at Generation C. I don't know. I've lost track of the generation. But
I think we're running out of letters and acronyms for them. But the point really, I think, is that, as I say, it's not just about what generation you are, but the behaviour and how people want to use technology or encourage to use technology or feel familiar with using it.
Yeah. And if you're interested, of course, shameless plug, Mark Prensky, who introduced the idea of digital natives, is speaking at the Learning Technologies Conference in January. So there we are.
Good. So just finally, a lot of these topics that we've been talking about and are highlighted in the various blogs, we're going to be publishing into a white paper, which is going to be available in draft form from the end of this month. But the reason I wanted to highlight the fact that it's coming is because we want to talk to people like yourselves, to your organisations, in an interactive event where we could actually extend this conversation, capture some of the thinking, and we'd like to republish it properly for Learning Technologies in January with some of that input. So if anybody's interested in contributing and being part of that dialogue, we'd be very keen to talk to you.
Fantastic. A lot of glib argument going on. I'm just going to put your email in here, so if you want to get in touch with Steve about that, please do. A lot of argument going on about generations. That always inspires a little bit of humorous comment.
Yeah, why is it we get fixated on the generations?
Well, it's because everyone's got something to say. Well, I'm delighted to have
all belong to one.
Well, we all belong to one, and as Zoe points out, remarkably, they all remain human. Anyway, delighted to have Deborah here, who's 17 years old. We're not going to give her, she must be the youngest person on the call. Great to have you with us, Deborah. I'm not going to say who the oldest person is. It could be me at 50. If there's somebody who's older, then great to have you here. Don't feel the need to stick your head above the parapet. Steve, is it time to move on to questions?
I think it is, yes.
Okay, lots of stuff coming up. As always, I mean, when you've got high-quality thinking, as you produced today, Steve, we always get high-quality audience and high-quality conversation. So plenty of stuff here. I'm going to start with technologies and tracking. Rich Calcutt and Lee W. were having not exactly a ding-dong, but a rich discussion about LMSs and their role, their usefulness and otherwise. What are your thoughts, Steve, on a phrase of Lee's, which was that too often people lock good content behind their LMS? In other words, that the technology sometimes is gets in the way of learning.
I think that's a very good way of summarising it. And of course, learning management systems grew out of training management systems, and it's the whole phrase of management being in there, and the way they are constructed and organised is for capturing data and pushing out content in a structured way. And that, I think, is the paradigm that, if it isn't fully broken, is breaking. And that's not to have a go at any of the learning management system vendors. I think the fact is that many of them are now realising that there's got to be a much more user-friendly front end to the way you can get at information that's pertinent to you. So we are finding, for example, a lot of organisations are ditching or hiding their LMS behind some sort of portal that is very much more user-friendly, focused, brand compliant, etc. But it is all about connecting learning management capability with all the other aspects of how you profile your students, your audience, your staff into where their learning needs are. So whatever stage of their career they're at, whatever their particular job role and competence base that they need. So if anything, learning management and HR management systems, I think, are converging. But again, I know a lot of organisations have got that connectivity between them, those systems, and integrated into an environment. But how is learning in your organisation presented to the learner? If you're relying on a learning management system interface to deliver that, I suspect that that was what was driving that comment.
Tess says, totally agree, LMS. The move away from them will be slow. I'm chairing a panel at Elliot Maisie's thing in a couple of weeks' time in the States about the lazy LMS and how it doesn't seem to do what we wanted to do. But I'm going to take a slightly provocative line. I'm going to say that we are as lazy as ourselves in the community when we think about LMSs, because I think actually a lot of these systems can do a lot more than we give them credit for. But we've sort of got bogged down in systems thinking from 10 to 5 years ago, when in fact there's been a lot of pushing forward. And I think I'd challenge everybody on the call to say, go out and consider how you can make the LMS do what you want it to do as part of your general mixture of things. But it's not for me to have that to start banging a drum. next question then, following on from that, which is about push and pull. Richard and Rich Calcutt and Cedric were saying, well, what about push and pull? How can we get people to use platforms such as Yammer more and to talk to each other and to take control of their learning more? I think we should be doing it, but as part of what you've been discussing, Steve, in the new learning organisation, do you think people are ready for it? Are we ready to have engaged learners, or do we learn too much in the first part of our lives that actually learning is about sitting back and being taught at?
I think there's multifacets to that. I think, firstly, the whole point of using social collaboration, social tools to share and exchange is, again, this generational thing that my teenage children have grown up with using it and don't think it unusual, whereas I personally am not a big user of Facebook and Twitter, or I do use LinkedIn, but those sort of things. However, they do add some value to sharing knowledge and the experience, but you've got to embrace it. And it was interesting that somebody last week had made the comment, I think it was Andrew Jacobs actually, why do we have to create social on our platforms rather than let people use their own? That's a very good question.
Very telling question.
The comment today was, how should we control that? And I actually think the sort of 70-20-10 forum is very much about you can't control it. As L&D, you can't manage it. You can support it, you can encourage it, but you can't control it. And that's the reality. And that's something that Elliot Maisy has been saying for years as well, is that, if you try to lock it down, your young generation will find a way to circumnavigate that lockdown anyway and still use it.
Yeah.
And you should embrace what it can bring, which is sometimes a wider perspective and the opportunity to bring an outside view into a new challenge. And interestingly, I think going back to the thinking of Elliot and some of his earlier messages, his view has always been that LMSs were really compliance management systems. So coming back to the comment about compliance being separate, I can see why compliance training has to have a management and recording function behind it that actually enables you to report to the regulatory body and deliver that information, who's done what. But at the end of the day, it should be demonstrated through performance. And how does an LMS capture performance?
Yes, the mistake is to imagine that any one device, including an LMS, is going to solve all the issues. It never is. N. Jones is having a bit of a not ding-dong, but he's pushing back on the LMS thing, saying, for those of us who don't have a dedicated coder, the off-the-shelf products don't appear to have been tested with L&D and HR professionals from any generation, and he's getting a lot of support on that line. So let's have some other technology getting a thumbs up. Berit and others on the call today have been talking about Yammer very, very positively. Berit says, I noticed that especially all L&D people and project managers seem to embrace it to start discussions and share knowledge. Now, coming back to this point of going where the people are, I think in the future we're going to see a lot more loose integration between technologies. So you'll have Yammer or Twitter or other technologies being used in conjunction with other systems and platforms, because if you set up your own separate social system, nobody goes there because they're already on Twitter or Yammer.
Yeah, and that's, I think, is a really key point as well, that too many of the technology vendors think that they've got to build all the bells and whistles into their platform and they're the only ones you'll use.
And it seldom is the case, is it?
And it's rarely the case. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on from that issue then to the role of L&D skills. Just briefly, but we had a flurry of stuff right in the middle of your talk. Dave and Cedric talking about self-directed learning, the skills gap. Is there more of a role for L&D being a facilitator and a moderator? But I wanted to expand that, Steve, and ask the question, do you think as a community we have the skills we need to be doing some of the things you're talking about, moving our organisations towards the new learning organisations? If so, what are the skills if not, what are the skills we need?
That's a very good point. And coming back to the evidence issue, there was a comment made last week as well that references that the feeling was that L&D professionals don't have good data analysis skills.
Yeah.
And I think that's a generalisation. I'm sure many of us do, but at the same time, the concept of being able to do proper research, corral proper data, dare I say, the evaluation word, that L&D hasn't been terribly strong on applying, whether you believe the Kirkpatrick's levels and all the rest of it, but the point of actually having a feedback loop from the training you've delivered, and that feedback loop not being just at the end of the course or the end of the session, but more about the higher levels of Kirkpatrick when you've actually demonstrated that you've applied that learning into some new behaviour and improved your performance. That all plays to the fact that, yes, L&D should be much more looking at the big picture than the tactical delivery, if you see what I mean.
I do see what you mean. I mean, I'm just noticing here we've got a comment. What would Elliot make of... Dean says it would be interesting to see what Elliot Macy says about measuring social media learning. I can't speak for Elliot, but I have chatted with him on several occasions. My guess is, well, actually I have raised this question with him, that he'd say the following. He'd say it doesn't matter what learning is. It doesn't matter whether it's done through one medium or another. What you should be measuring is, as you just said, Steve, the outcome, the impact, what's actually happening. The way you get to that point is irrelevant.
And yeah, that's the point, the base of this whole collect the evidence piece. Otherwise, if you're not using evidence to determine your pathway forward, what are you using?
Yeah, quite. Big data is coming, says Con. Yeah, I've written a chapter in a book about big data. We'll have a big data webinar at some point next year, I think.
I'd be interested to know from the community as well is whether connected to big data and what you do with it, how you analyse it, whether the sort of tin can API experience API, I should say, is becoming significant to them. We're finding a relatively slow uptake from our perspective, although we are seeing people beginning to see the value of capturing much more information than you can just get out of a SCORM SCO. So that plays to the fact if you're going to collect a lot of data, how are you going to analyse it, how are you going to produce it in a way that's useful to the individual, the management, the organisation. So, dashboards and things like that are becoming much more an important part of how that data gets analysed.
My point about L&D and big data in this chapter I just wrote was, never mind about big data, we can't even handle small data at the moment. And I do this on the basis of research at the Learning and Performance Institute, which I chair, looking into the skills of L&D professionals. And it's not surprising, most of us, myself included, come from a classroom training background. I happen to have data skills as well, but most people don't, for good reason. However, it's going to be essential in the future. And the problem is if we don't have those skills, other people will have. Suddenly the data won't be our servant, but be our master, especially in somebody else's hands. That concerns me. Question from... It was from M. Jones, saying, was the driver for Yammer, just coming back to this point, I think it's a very interesting one, from L&D or other departments in the organisation? My experience is that generally, where we should be taking the lead, too often, Steve, actually somebody else in the organisation is taking the lead in doing things innovatively to help us move forward. Do you think that, is that something you've experienced, that actually a lot of the things that we might have thought in the past were learning functions or learning projects are actually being done elsewhere by, I don't know, sales or marketing, for example?
Yeah, I think so. And I come back to my point about mobile not being owned by learning and development. If you are putting out information on a mobile phone or a tablet that is marketing driven, or it's corporate communications or whatever it is, people are going to be using that, and L&D may have had no input to it. However, making use and linking in with that channel, if you like, is really one of the challenges I think we're saying a new learning organisation has to address.
I think we shouldn't just be addressing it. Actually, we should be at the front leading it and showing good practice with it. Interestingly, both Berrett and John Talbot are saying, look, it was the IS/IT department that led with the implementation of Yammer in their organisations. And John's saying wouldn't be without it. Marketing pushed Yammer in our organisation, but it never took off, says Dean. So that's the other side of it. Any ideas how learning could reinvigorate it? Well, look, Dean's got an issue here. If anybody on the call can help him, drop your ideas down from Dean. How can you make good use of a social microblogging platform like Yammer in an organisation? My advice would be find a small area where it can be useful and get proof of its success which will then spread elsewhere in the organisation. But please, help Dean out. This is what we're here for, to build on each other's knowledge. I've got one last question then to ask you, and it comes from Berit again, who's been a big contributor today. So many people, Steve, have ideas of facilitating the pull of knowledge, and yet the company doesn't seem to have ideas on how to facilitate it. Now, coming back to this idea of knowledge being important, we focus a lot on skills as a profession. Steve, do you think what do you think the role of knowledge is in all this as well? We sometimes can be quite dismissive of it. You can look it up or what have you, but actually, knowledge very often, procedures, special company recipes, whatever, are the things that make an organisation different from something else, help it succeed.
Yeah, exactly. And translating that knowledge into actual behaviour is quite a key piece. And some organisations don't even treat knowledge management as part of the L&D framework. The key to this is, of course, there's two things. I think one is, at a very high level, I often use the phrase the know-where, not the know-how, because we all know that the knowledge culture has changed over the years because so much information is out there. You can't retain it all. So it's actually about using knowledge bases, having proper taxonomies, search environments connected to them so that people can find what they need easily. And that, for me, is another big challenge, coming back to the question about LMS and integration of technologies and everything else. One federated search environment across your whole organization, not just to be able to search learning content on the LMS and then having to go to another tool to search the PR material from marketing or whatever it is. I think that is a really key opportunity for L&D to take a lead and to get with IT to make a much more federated solution. And fundamentally to that is, how do we use that knowledge in a constructive way? So it's about being able to segment it down to the right level, the granularity that is easy for people to get what level they need, whether I want an overview, whether I want an in-depth, or I want some way of assessing my full understanding and mastery of it. All of those pieces are where the knowledge and the learning piece have to come together.
Very good, and thank you for that comprehensive thing. Love the idea of a comprehensive federated search. And of course, that, for me, is learning, taking a step forward, being at the forefront rather than being reactive on the back foot. Fantastic. Great responses here for Dean. Thank you very much for helping me out, guys. A lot of good thoughts coming through. And for me, one particular phrase sums it up. Whimsy, says Andrew Jacobs, is important, needs to be allowed. And Martine says that the in-house version that they've had of Yammer includes a marketplace of buying and selling stuff, and that brings people in. What a great idea. A lot of people I've talked to about this have said that having the social side of it, the genuinely social side of it, actually is crucial. Being stuffy and keeping it off doesn't work. Give people a good reason for going there. Let them chat. My goodness, we've had a fantastic chat today. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. I've got to be out of here in 2 minutes' time. Just time to wrap up. If you've enjoyed it, as I have, please let the world know through the hashtag LSG webinar. Sorry, let me just move on here. I've got a slight issue with my computer. You'll be delighted to know. I'll have a new computer by the time we speak next time. LSG webinar. Everything should be available soon on the Learning and Skills Group website, certainly by Monday, we hope tomorrow. Thank you very much for all your big thumbs up. We're getting all these thanks in the
well, thank you very much, everyone, and I'm very glad we made it to the end this time, but it isn't the end. I want to continue the conversation, and very, very delighted to hear from anyone.
What a splendid way of putting it. Look, I've done my URL tracker, and they're all URLs that I can shake a stick at here, but please, those are some of the URLs that Steve brought up during his presentation. Please feel free to click on those. Of course, they will all be available on the Learning and Skills Group afterwards. Just going to put the URL for that group into the area so that you've got it ready to click on when you want to get through. Please come along and join it. It's free. It's a conversation. It's, if you like, what we do here, but much more of it. Next webinars are on the 7th of November. We've got Jo, I can't remember her surname, excuse me, talking about new pedagogical methods and the flipped classroom. And we've got Laura Overton doing the world premiere of the results of Towards Maturity. Steve's Twitter handle. Steve, could you write your Twitter handle into the text chat area, please? That'd be great. I think we're done. That's everything I've had time for today. I want to say thank you to everybody who's contributed, as always, for a great job here. It's great that we always get so much participation. I learn a lot, as always. Steve has, and remains for me to say thank you once again to Steve for a great job in sharing his thoughts in this field. By no means an esoteric, arcane subject, something that's really important to all of us. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. Steve, once again, thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.